All right, guys. So what we have here is we're starting to begin to see division. We've talked about era of good feeling. We've talked about nationalism, and then that industrialization and national infrastructure, states' rights. The economies are different. While they're linked together, now we're going to start looking at division. And we've already seen a little bit of sectionalism, meaning pride in each section of where you're from. Where you're going to have the southern states versus the northern states. And then what is the West going to look like? Is the West going to look like the South, or is the West going to look like the North? So we're still going to dig a little deeper into abolitionism, the abolition movement, and of course, manifest destiny. Now, because those two are directly tied to each other, and those two are directly tied to division. Now, leading abolitionists. So you already should know what abolition is based off the video we watched yesterday. And abolition is just pretty much these individuals that want to abolish slavery. And so we have many different groups of people, many different types of people, which are going to go about it different ways. So one of the first events that we're going to discuss here is a guy by the name of Nat Turner. And Nat Turner is going to have a rebellion. Now, before I get there, you notice this symbol right here, am I not a man and a brother? This becomes to be an image that represents the abolitionist movement. And so if you see this image right here, this is something I want you to be able to associate with the abolitionist movement and the abolishment of slavery. So one of the very first people we have is Nat Turner. Well, Nat Turner was a slave who was a preacher. Nat Turner could read and write. And so what Nat Turner is going to believe is that he receives a vision from God that it was his job to overthrow the institution of slavery. So he's going to use his following, and this is and he's a preacher, and preachers naturally have a flock, a group of people that follow them. And so Nat Turner is going to have this massive slave rebellion, and it's going to be slightly successful. Over 60 individuals will be killed. And as you can see, this is a famous cartoon, a political drawing of it, and you can see how it starts as they're going through, and then eventually the rebellion is put down. Well, this is very important because you have people that are trying to abolish slavery and many different facets, and rebellion is just one form of those. But he was a slave preacher whose rebellion, and this is big, caused stricter slave laws in hopes to stop future slave results. So while you have rebellions like Nat Turner's and you have under individuals who are pushing the abolitionist movement, instead of slavery beginning to see its way out, you see stricter laws, the complete opposite of what people want to happen. One of the major examples that we're going to see is that slaves after this will see laws begin to pass where they can no longer learn to read and write. One of the successes associated with Nat Turner's rebellion is the fact that the slaves could read and write, and so they knew exactly, listening to the people and knowing when they would leave, they knew they could read road signs, and so the people felt that they could, if they took that away, they could limit some more slave rebellions. So big idea here, though, is that once we're beginning to see people advocating getting rid of slavery, but we're seeing stricter laws. And this occurred in 1831. Now, while we've also seen a slave and a preacher who's advocating for it, we also see other leading abolitionists, and of course, William Lloyd Garrison. And William Lloyd Garrison was a preacher as well. He was a man from New England, and he is actually going to advocate. He's going to have a newspaper that is going to continuously advocate for the abolition of slavery. So important to recognize him. He has an abolitionist newspaper. It's called The Liberator because he wants to liberate slaves. He is a New England preacher. And now this is very important because we talked about this, but this is a review. William Lloyd Garrison is a symbol. While there were others, he just became the most popular a symbol of how the Second Great Awakening, something we talked about with the reform movements, with the women's rights movement, which we saw how it was connected yesterday, with the temperance movement, with the women's rights, like we said, with the suffrage, with all these movements that are going on, public education. We must remember that the Second Great Awakening is having a major impact on all of these, and really that religious revival, which is pushing people for equality, is going on. All right, and then of course we have someone that everybody needs to be able to recognize, and of course this being Frederick Douglass. So we have a slave preacher, we have a free man living in the New England, a preacher, and then we also have Frederick Douglass, who had his own abolitionist newspaper called the Northern Star. Frederick Douglass was an escaped slave who then wrote an autobiography over his own life, which gave people a view into slavery that they had never seen before. William Lloyd Garrison is actually going to give Frederick Douglass a start. He's going to allow him to write in his newspaper, and then of course Frederick Douglass will then sit down and he will talk with, during the Civil War, he'll talk with Abraham Lincoln and talk about the things that need to be done. He's going to be a symbol for what it is to be to push for that abolitionist movement. Now, we also have women abolitionists, which was mentioned yesterday. We see people like Lucretia Mott. And this is a good quote which connects the two, women's rights movement and the abolishment of slavery. I have no idea of submitting tamely to injustice inflicted either on me or the slave. I oppose it with all moral powers with which I am endowed. I am no advocate of passivity. So sitting back and doing nothing, she felt like it was important that while we were advocating for women, that we should be advocating, and they should be advocating for the rights of slaves as well. And so we also have the Grimke sisters. This is Angela and Sarah Grimke. And now these are Southern women who grew up and came from a family that owned slaves, and then they went and they talked about what they witnessed occurring to slaves as they were growing up, and the tragic things that happened. And so this gave more and more support to, of course, the abolitionist movement. Now, as we begin to look at the abolitionist movement, here is a big idea, guys. The question is, as we gain more states, what is going to happen? Are they going to look, again, are these new territories going to look more like the South, or are they going to look more like the North? Are they going to be slave states that allow slavery? Or are they going to be left up to the states to decide? So there's a lot of issues that are going on. So first, in 1820, we have to address this issue. The United States has to address this issue. In what territory? In the Louisiana Territory. So what we have is why? Statehood for Missouri would upset the U.S. Senate's equal balance between pro-slavery and anti-slavery senators. So long story short is that they want to maintain an equal balance between free and slave states. Why? Because that way no one would have more power in the Senate. So there has to be a compromise. Missouri is the compromise. What it did is that Maine, so they carved out a new territory. They just said, all right, we're going to take this territory. We're going to create Maine out of Massachusetts. Let's admit it as a free state. Missouri would then be admitted as a slave state. Slavery would be prohibited in the northern part of the Louisiana Territory, aka something known as the 3630 latitude, except for Missouri. And in the southern part, slavery would be allowed. What does this do? Oh, well, first, this is a visual of what the Missouri Compromise looked like. So what we're looking at here, all right, so what we're looking at here, guys, is this is the Louisiana Territory right here, all right? And so what we have is Missouri has just applied for statehood. And so they want to maintain an equal balance of free and slave states. And so they said, all right, we're also going to have to address the issue later on. So let's establish this 3630 parallel right here. Everything above this parallel would be closed to slavery, meaning slavery could not expand except for Missouri. That would be allowed. Everything below the territory, it would be open to slavery. This was known as the 3630 parallel, which of course, which is the southern border of Missouri and the dividing line of free and slave states in the Louisiana Territory. So we will continue to go on with this a little bit later, but this is just an introduction of abolition and how the issue of slavery is being addressed by people advocating wanting to get rid of it, while some are still wanting it to expand.